Hi. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the talk that we had planned for GDC. But we do have some super exciting news about PS5. And who better to bring that to you than the one and only Mark Cerny. Without further ado,
Oh, they're doing
over to
this
you,
in
Mark.
they're doing this in their New York building. I've been here. I've done a.
There will be lots of chances later on this year to look at the PlayStation 5 games. Today, I want to talk a bit about our goals for
I've
the
been in this
PlayStation
room
5
before.
hardware
That's so funny.
and how they influenced the development of the console. I think you all know I'm a big believer in console generations. Once every 5 or 6 or 7 years, a console arrives with substantially new capabilities. There's a lot of learning by the game developers, hopefully not too overwhelming, and soon there's games that could never have been created before.
Like
Now,
Knack.
it used to be that as a console designer, you'd somehow intuit what would be the best set of capabilities for the new console, and then build it in complete secrecy. For the PlayStation consoles, that period lasted through PlayStation 3, a powerful and groundbreaking console, but also one that caused quite a lot of heartache, as it was initially difficult to develop games for. So, starting with PlayStation 4,
very
we've
honest.
taken a different approach, roughly centered around 3 principles. The first of these is listening to the developers, which is to say that a lot of what we put into a console derives directly from the needs and aspirations of the game creators. We definitely do have some ideas of our own, but at the core of our
My bad, guys.
creators. We definitely do have some ideas of our own, but at the core of our philosophy for designing consoles is that game players are here for the fantastic games, which is to say that game creators matter. Anything we can do to make life easier for the game creators or help them realize their dreams, we will do. So, about once every 2 years, I take a tour of the industry. I go to the various developers and publishers, sit down, and discuss how they're doing with the current consoles and what they'd like
This
to
is
see
so
in
bizarre
future
watching
consoles.
this happen.
This requires weeks on the road, as reaching the bulk of the game creators involves talking to well over 100 people.
It looks like a
and something
parody.
Like 2 dozen publishers and developers. And it is incredibly valuable. By the way, the feature most requested by the developers, that was an SSD, which we were very happy to put in the hardware, but a lot of problem solving was required. I'll be doing a deep dive on the SSD and surrounding systems later on in this talk. It's also key to make a generational leap while keeping the console sufficiently familiar to game developers. I think about this in terms of balancing evolution and revolution. Now, with PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, the target was a revolution each time with a brand new feature set. That was great in many ways, but time for the developers to get up and running got longer with each console. In the past, I've called this time to triangle. Here's what I had for those 3 consoles. To be
That
clear,
sounds like
I'm
some
not talking
fucking
about
shit
time to make a game. Developers
Silicon
will be
Valley.
ambitious, and it may take them 6 years or so to realize their vision. What I'm talking about is that dead time before graphics and other aspects of game development are up and running, and trying to minimize that. On the other hand, if we're trying to reduce that dead time to 0, that means the hardware architecture can't change at all. We're handcuffed. We need to judge for each feature what value it adds and whether it's worth the increase in developer time needed to support it. So with PlayStation 4, we were able to strike a pretty good balance between performance and familiarity. We got required learning back to PlayStation 1 levels. With PS5, the GPU was definitely the area we felt the most tension between adding new features and keeping a familiar programming model.
It's going to be like 0 months.
Ultimately, I think we've ended up with
Wow.
something under a month of getting up to speed.
I mean,
that
that's
feels
impressive.
like we're striking about the right balance. I'll go into a bit more detail later today about our philosophy with the GPU and the specific feature set that resulted from it.
The architecture is basically the
It's
same as the PS4.
also very important for us,
Just
as the hardware team, to find new dreams, by which I mean something other
Updated.
than CPU performance, GPU performance, and the amount of RAM. The increase in graphics performance over the past 2 decades has been astonishing, but there are other areas in which we can innovate and provide significant value to the game creators, and through them, the players. That's why the SSD was very much on our list of directions to explore, regardless of what came out of the conversations with game developers and publishers. The biggest feature in this category is the custom engine for audio. That's today's final topic. The push for vastly improved audio, and in particular 3D audio, isn't something that came out of the developer meetings. It's much more the case that we had a dream of what might be possible 5 years from now, and then worked out a number of steps we could take to set us on that path. So here again are the three principles, the first being enabling the desires of developers to drive the hardware design. To me, the SSD really is the key to the next generation. It's a game changer. And it was the #1 ask from developers for PlayStation 5. As in, we know it's probably impossible, but
He's
can
saying
we
that
put
the
an
SSD is going to be the most
That was a
important
discussion we were
aspect of
also
the
having
PlayStation
internally.
5.
It was clear that the presence of a hard drive in every PlayStation 4 was having a positive
That's what
impact.
I thought,
A lot of
Sconzi.
things that would simply have been
They're not.
impossible
They
with
have been
Blu-ray
moving,
disc
but
speed
I
were now
thought they
possible.
were cutouts.
At the same time, though, in 2015 and 2016, when we were having these conversations, developers were
No, they're
already
real
banging
people.
up
You can
against
see
the
'em
limits of
moving.
the hard drive. And a lot of developer time was being spent designing around slow load speeds. I want to focus in on just one number here, which is how long it takes to load a gigabyte of data from a hard drive. The difficulty being that hard drives are neither particularly fast nor flexible. If all your data is in one block, which is frankly not very likely, you can load 50 to 100
No,
megabytes
it's
a
pre-recorded.
second,
It's
depending on where the
pre-recorded,
data
for
is
sure.
located on the hard drive.
These graphics
Let's
are
assume it's
really
on the
fucking
outer edge,
bad.
which means loading a gigabyte takes 10 seconds. If you compress your game packages, you can fit more data on the Blu-ray disc and also effectively boost your hard drive read speed by the compression ratio. We support zlib decompression on PlayStation 4 that gets you something like 50% more data on the disk and 50% higher effective read speed. Unfortunately, though, it's highly likely that your data is scattered
speak it.
around in
I
various
understand what he's
files
talking
on the
about.
hard drive, as well as sourced from multiple locations within those files. So lots of seeks are needed at 2 to 50-ish milliseconds.
The thing
each.
is this was meant to
My rule of
be
thing is that the hard drive
at
is spent in
GDC. Like,
2/3
this
of
is
its
meant to
time
be in
seeking,
front of
and
developers.
only a third of its time actually
But they
loading
couldn't
data.
do that, so
Putting
they're
all of
doing
that
this.
together, a gigabyte is very roughly 20 seconds to load from a hard drive. Now, a gigabyte is not much data. Games are using 5 or 6 gigabytes of RAM on PlayStation 4, so boot times and load times can get pretty grim. Or to put that differently, as a player, you wait for the game to boot, wait for the game to load, wait for the level to reload every time you die, and you wait for what is euphemistically called fast travel.
While he is talking
All
about a
of
lot
that
of stuff,
leads to the
I
dream.
do think that
What if we
he
could have not just an SSD, but a
I
blindingly
do think he
fast
is able
SSD?
to
If we could
eloquently
load 5
explain and
gigabytes a second from it,
pretty
what
clearly
would
explain
change?
what's happening. He's
Now,
using a lot of big
SSDs
words,
are
but you
completely
understand what
different
he's
from
saying.
hard drives. They don't have seeks.
So you're
as
saying
such.
that it takes about
if you
20
have
seconds
a 5 gigabyte a second SSD, you
to
can
load
read
a
data
gig
from
on the
1,000
PS4.
different locations in that second, pretty much at speed. As for time to load a gigabyte,
So this is
this
gonna be-
next gen we're talking about. So memory is bigger. Instead, we should be asking how long to load 2 gigabytes. And the answer is about a quarter of a second. I mean, that's amazing. We're talking 2 orders of magnitude.
That's
meaning
impressive.
very roughly 100 times faster. Which means at 5 gigabytes a second for the SSD, the potential is that the game boots in a second. There are no load screens. The game just fades down while loading a half dozen gigabytes and fades back up again. Same for a reload. You're immediately back in the action.
I love
after you
this
die.
graphic.
And fast travel
time
becomes so
warp portal.
fast it's blink and you miss it. As game creators, we go from trying to distract the player from how
They
long
threw
fast
this
travel is
together
taking,
so
like those
haphazardly at the
Spider-Man
last second.
subway rides, to being so blindingly fast that we might even have to slow that transition down. Pretty cool, right? But for me, this is not the primary reason to change
such a
from a hard drive to
weirdo.
an SSD. The primary reason for an ultra-fast SSD is that it gives the game designer freedom. Or to put that differently, with a hard drive, the 20 seconds that it takes to load a gigabyte can sabotage the game that the developer is trying to create. I think almost all of us in the room have experienced this, maybe in different ways. Say we're making an adventure game and we have 2 rich environments where we each want enough textures and models to fill memory, which you can do as long as you have a long staircase or elevator ride or a windy corridor where you can ditch the old assets and then take 30 seconds or so to load the new assets. Having a 30-second elevator ride is a little extreme. More realistically, we'd probably chop the world into a number of smaller pieces and then do some calculations with sight lines and run speeds like we did for Haven City when we were making Jak 2. The game is 20 years old, but not much has changed since then. All those twisty
I can't believe we're
passages are
talking
there
about
for a
Jak
reason.
2 right now.
There's a whole subset of level design dedicated to this sort of work, but still, it's a giant distraction for a team that just wants to make their game. So when I talked about the dream of an SSD, part of the reason for that 5 GB a second target was to eliminate loads, but also part of the reason for that target was streaming.
It's so
As in,
bizarre.
what if the SSD is so fast that as the player is turning
It can
around,
load the whole
it's
room.
possible to load textures for everything behind the player in that split second? If you figure that it takes half a second to turn, that's 4 GB of compressed data you can load. That sounds about right for next gen. Anyway, back to the hard drive. Another strategy for increasing effective read speed is to make big sequential chunks of data.
I love it.
For example, we might group all the data together.
This is
for
the
each single
nerdiest
block.
shit I've ever watched.
That removes most of the seeks, and the streaming gets
No,
faster.
nothing about VR.
But there's a
We're not gonna
downside,
hear
too,
anything about
which is
VR.
that frequently used data is included in many chunks and therefore is on the hard drive many, many times. Marvel's Spider-Man uses this strategy, and though it works very well for increasing the streaming speed, there's a massive duplication as a result. Some of the objects like mailboxes or news racks are on the hard drive 400 times. What I'm describing here are things that cramp a creative director's style. Either level design gets a little bit boring in places, or the data is duplicated so many times that it no longer fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run speed or driving speed. The player can't go faster than the load speed from the hard drive. And finally, I'm sure many of you have noticed
They're
that
talking about
after
Sonic.
first download, the PlayStation 4
It's
will
literally the
sometimes
same
take a long
discussion
time
Sega
to
had
install
about
the
Sonic
package.
on the Genesis.
That's because when just part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that includes the changed portion. Otherwise, every change would add a seek or two. Even so, you can occasionally see this happening on game titles. They start to hitch once they get patched enough. With an SSD, though, no seeks, so no need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today. There's
Purdy,
yet
it basically
one more
means
benefit,
that
which is that system memory can be used
they're
much
not
more
going to have to
efficiently.
build any
On
tricks into the
PlayStation
game
4,
to prevent
game
you
data on
from
the hard drive feels very
going
distant
somewhere.
and difficult to use. By the time you realize you need a piece
Like
of data,
every-
it's
like you're
much
never gonna-
too late
like
to go out
pop-in
and
is a
load it.
thing of the
So
past.
system
Pop-in
memory
just
has to
doesn't
contain
exist
all
anymore.
of the data that could be used in the next 30 seconds or so of gameplay. That means a lot of the 8 GB of system memory is idle. It's just waiting there to be potentially used. On PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more RAM. Typically, it's fast enough that when you realize you need a piece of data, you can just load it from the SSD and use it. There's no need to have lots of data parked in system memory waiting to potentially be used. A different way of saying that is that most of RAM is working on the game's behalf. This is one of the reasons that 16 GB of GDDR6 feels right for PlayStation 5. The presence of the SSD reduces the need for a massive intergenerational increase in
Interesting.
size. So back to the dream of the SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the game in a second. No load screens. Design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long corridors. More game on the disk and more game on the SSD. And finally, those patch installs go away. The reality, though, is that the SSD is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of places where bottlenecks can occur in between the SSD and the game code that uses the data. You can see this on PlayStation 4. If I use an SSD with 10 times the speed of a standard hard drive, I probably see only double the loading speed, if that. For PlayStation 5, our goal was not just that the SSD itself be 100 times faster. It was that game loads and streaming would be 100 times faster. So every single potential bottleneck needed to be addressed. And there are a lot of them. Let's look at check-in and what happens when its overhead gets 100 times larger. Conceptually, check-in is a pretty simple process. Data is loaded into system memory from the hard drive or SSD. It's examined, a few values are tweaked to check it in, and then it's moved to its final location.
It's more industry related in the
SSD
terms that it
speeds we're talking
focuses
about,
on developers.
that last
yes.
part, moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire
I mean, I have an
next-gen
SSD
CPU.
installed. It's not
And that's
just about
the tip
having
of
an
the
SSD.
iceberg. If
I have
all
an
the
SSD
overheads
installed
get
in my
100 times larger,
PS4.
that will cripple the frame rate as soon as the player
It's
moves,
about
and
them
that massive
building a
stream of
custom
data starts coming
SSD
off the SSD.
that is
So
specifically
to solve
designed
all of
for
that,
gaming.
we built a lot of custom hardware, namely a custom flash controller and a number of custom
Like
units
it's
in
an
our
SSD focused
the
on
flash
game
controller in the
development.
SSD was designed
It's
for
the same.
smooth and
It's
bottleneck-free
Xbox is doing
operation,
it for
but also
the
with
Series
games
X
in
as
mind.
well.
For example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading from the SSD. Priority is very important. You can imagine the player heading into some new location in the world and the game requesting a few gigabytes of textures. And while those textures
Yeah,
are being
pretty much.
loaded, an enemy is shot and has to speak a few dying words. Having multiple priority levels lets the audio for those dying words get loaded immediately. On one side, that flash controller connects to the actual flash dies that supply the storage. To reach our bandwidth target of 5 gigabytes a second, we ended up with a 12-channel interface. 8 channels wouldn't be enough. The resulting bandwidth we have achieved is actually 5.5 gigabytes a second. With a 12-channel interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but Flash certainly doesn't come cheap, and we have a responsibility to our gaming audience to be cost-effective with regards to what we put in the console. Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of gamers. We examined the specific games that they were playing over the course of a weekend or a week or a month, and whether that set of games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstalls or redownloads would be quite low, and so we locked in on that 825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that those who want more storage can add it. I'll go through the details in a moment. Back to the flash controller. On the other side,
So
it connects to our main
mean,
custom chip via 4 lanes of Gen 4
It's
PCIe.
essentially a terabyte,
And inside the main custom chip is a pretty hefty
but it's
unit
also
dedicated
not.
to audio. Before we talk about what that does, let's talk compression for a moment. PlayStation 4 used
825.
zlib as its compression format. We decided to use it again on PlayStation 5, but
What the
on
fuck
the
is this?
2017 tour of developers, I learned
A
about
picture
a new
of a Kraken?
format called Kraken from Rad Game Tools. It's like zlib's smarter cousin. Simple, similar types of algorithms, but about 10% better compression, which is pretty big. That means 10% more game on the UHD Blu-ray disc or on the SSD. Kraken had only been out for a year, but it was already becoming a de facto industry standard. Half of the teams I talked to were either using it or
No,
getting ready
that's
to
a Sony
evaluate
Vaio laptop,
So we
Jedi.
hustled and built a custom decompressor
Or a
into the
a
IO
Vaio
unit,
tablet or
one
whatever.
capable of handling over 5 gigabytes of Kraken format input data a second. After decompression, that typically becomes 8 or 9 gigabytes. But the
2
unit
teraflops
itself
slower
is
than the
capable
Series
of
X. Yeah, the
outputting as
rumored
much
thing
as
is it's 9
22
teraflops of power
gigabytes
in
a
the
second
PS5. But
if the
again,
data happen to compress particularly well.
teraflops is such an
By the way,
arbitrary
in terms
number.
of performance,
It's such an
that
arbitrary
custom
idea of
decompressor
computing
equates
power.
to 9 of our Zen 2
I bet
cores.
you
That's
loading
what it would
times
take
and
to
everything will
decompress
be better on the
Kraken stream
PlayStation
with
than
the
they are on the
conventional
Xbox Series
CPU.
X.
There's a lot more in the custom I/O unit, including a dedicated DMA controller. The game
I
can
think
direct
games
exactly
will run at
where
higher
it wants to send
resolutions
the data coming off of the SSD. This
On the
equates
Series
to
X
another
and probably
Zen 2
higher
core
frame
or
rates,
two in
but the
terms of its
PlayStation
copy
5 will
performance.
have,
Its primary purpose is to remove check-in
I mean, the
as a
speed
bottom.
of loading and moving through
There's
games
2
and things
dedicated
like that is
I/O
going to be better on a
coprocessors and a
PlayStation
large
5.
RAM pool. These aren't Zen 2 cores. They're there principally to direct the variety of custom hardware around them. One of the coprocessors
We
is
talk
dedicated
about what
to
teraflops
SSD
means,
This
I
lets
think,
us
on one of the
bypass
recent episodes
traditional
of the
file
podcast.
I/O and its bottlenecks when reading from the SSD. The other is responsible for memory mapping, which I know doesn't sound like anything related to the SSD, but a lot of developers map and remap memory as part of
Series X
file
is the new
I/O,
Xbox.
and this too can become a bottleneck. There are coherency engines to assist the coprocessors. Coherency comes up a lot in places. Probably the biggest coherency issue is stale data in the GPU caches. Flushing all of the GPU caches whenever the SSD is read is an unattractive
Not while
option.
you're in quarantine,
It could
Jedi.
really hurt the GPU performance. So we've implemented a gentler way of doing things. where the coherency engines inform the GPU
They're talking
of the
more about
overwritten
how
address ranges, and
in
custom
computing you have
scrubbers in
bottlenecks,
several
right?
dozen
You have
GPU caches do
something
pinpoint
has
evictions of just those
a
addresses.
certain amount of speed, but as
The
it's
best thing
interacting with
is,
other
as a
parts
game
of the machine
developer,
and
when you
doing
read
things,
from
that
the
speed
SSD, you
becomes
don't need to
smaller
know
and
any
smaller
of
the
this.
more
You
computing
don't even need
processing
to
it's
know
doing.
that your data
And they're
is
talking about
compressed.
the systems
You
that they
just
have that
indicate
kind of
what data you'd like to read from
are
your original
alleviating that
uncompressed file
burden,
and where
and
you'd like to
therefore
put it. And the whole
the
process
machine
of
is
loading it
actually hitting
happens
the
invisibly
computing
to you
power
and at very
that
fast speed.
it
Back to the dream.
is
Thanks
promised.
to all of that
Right,
surrounding
like, so
hardware,
5.5
our
gigabits per second
really
is,
should translate into something
in
like
theory, what
100
they're going to
times
hit,
faster
but
I/O
that's
for
not going to.
PS4,
That
and allow
wouldn't
the
have been the
dream of
actuality
no load screen
because of
and
how
super fast streaming to become a
computing
reality.
parts work
Having said
and
that,
interact. But
expandability
they've
of our
built
SSD is
things
going to
that
be quite
open up
important.
those
Flash
bottlenecks
is
so they
costly,
are
and
as
you may
close to
very
hitting
well
that
want to
target as
add
possible.
storage
Is
to
what
whatever
is
we put in the console.
roughly what he's talking about right
Now,
now.
the kind of storage you need depends on how you're going to use it. If you have an extensive PlayStation 4 library and you'd like to take advantage of backwards compatibility to play those games on PlayStation 5, then a large external hard drive is ideal.
I
You
think
can
Xbox
leave your games on the hard drive
will
and play them
maneuver
directly
to
from there,
VR at some
thus
point.
saving the price
But I
of SSD
understand that they're
storage for
not
PlayStation 5
making it a
titles.
focus
Or you can
at the
copy
beginning
your
of this
active
generation.
PlayStation 4 titles to the SSD. If your purpose in adding more storage is to play
And I
PlayStation
don't think they'll
5
release their
titles,
own
though,
headset. They'll just
ideally you would
partner.
add
I
to
mean,
your
didn't they
SSD
partner with
storage.
like Oculus
We will be
before?
supporting
Like,
certain M2 SSDs.
I'm sure they'll do
These
something
are
like that.
internal drives that you can get on the open market and install in a bay in the PlayStation 5. As for which ones we support and when, I'll get to that in a moment. They connect through the custom I/O unit just like our SSD does, so they can take full advantage of the decompression, I/O coprocessors, and all the other features I was talking about. Here's the catch, though. That commercial drive has to be at least as fast as ours. Games that rely on the speed of our SSD need to work flawlessly with any M2 drive. When I gave the Wired interview last year, I said that the PlayStation 5 SSD was faster than anything available on PC. At the time, commercial M2 drives used PCIe 3.0, and 4 lanes of that cap out at 3.5 gigabytes a second. In other words, no PCIe 3.0 drive can hit the required spec. M2 drives with PCIe 4.0 are now out in the market. We're getting samples and seeing 4 or 5 gigabytes a second from them. By year's end, I expect there will be drives that saturate 4.0 and support 7 gigabytes a second. Having said that, we are comparing apples and oranges, though, because that commercial M2 drive will have its own architecture, its own flash controller, and so on. For example, the NVMe specification lays out a priority scheme for requests that the M2 drives can use. And that scheme is pretty nice, but it only has 2 true priority levels. Our drive supports 6. We can hook up a drive with only 2 priority levels, definitely, but our custom I/O unit has to arbitrate the extra priorities rather than the M2 drive's flash controller.
They're going to
so
sell
the
their own
M2 drive needs
proprietary
a little
SSD.
extra speed to take care of issues arising from
Externally.
a different approach. That commercial drive also needs to physically fit inside of the bay we created in PlayStation 5 for M2 drives. Unlike internal hard drives, there's unfortunately no standard for the height of an M2 drive, and some M2 drives have giant heat sinks. In fact, some of them even have their own fans. Right now, we're getting M2 drive samples.
we're
and
not gonna see the
benchmarking
box.
them in various ways. When games hit beta as they get ready for the PlayStation 5 launch,
I usually
year-end, we'll
agree,
also be
Jedi,
doing
but
some
they
compatibility
Xbox
tests
is
to make
doing the
sure
same
that
thing. Like
architecture of particular M2
they're like,
drives
hey,
isn't too
what we want
foreign
to
for the
do
games
is
to
not
handle.
possible
Once we've
with
done that
just drives that you
compatibility
can
testing,
buy.
we should be able to start letting you know
from-
which drives will physically fit.
There's
and
an
which
actual
drive
reason
samples have
behind the
benchmarked appropriately
proprietary
high in our testing.
technology.
It would be great if that happened by launch, but it's likely to be a bit past it. So please hold off on getting that M2 drive until you hear from us. Okay, back to our principles. Balancing evolution and revolution is the second of them. This was definitely a recurring theme with the GPU. We need new GPU features and capabilities. If we only have more performance, it's not really a new generation of console. Of course, many of these capabilities result in more performance. That's part of why a PlayStation 5 teraflop is more powerful than a PlayStation 4 teraflop. But we aren't just looking for the performance. We also need the ability to do something with the GPU that could not have been done before. And we
I mean, if
need
you're
higher
talking about like the
performance per
Vita
watt.
cards,
Every time we double the
100%.
performance of some GPU component, we don't want to find out we've doubled the power consumed and the heat produced. But at the same time, we have to make sure the GPU can run PS4 games, and we have to ensure that the architecture is easy for the developers to adopt. Now, backwards compatibility was handled masterfully by AMD. They treated it as a key need throughout the design process. As our solution to adding new features without blindsiding developers, we made sure that if there were new significant features, it would be optional to use them. The GPU supports ray tracing, but you don't have to use ray tracing to make your game. The GPU supports primitive shaders, but you can release your first game on PlayStation 5 without making any use of them. Before I get into the capabilities of the GPU, I'd like to make clear 2 points that can be quite confusing. First, we have a custom AMD GPU based on their RDNA 2 technology. What does that mean? AMD is continuously improving and revising their tech. For RDNA 2, their goals were, roughly speaking,
I mean, they're real people, but I guess
reduce
they've just
power
composited
consumption
them
by
in there.
re-architecting the GPU to put data closer
And
to
they
where
probably
it's
only have like
to optimize the
a minute
GPU
or
for
two of them
performance
just like
and to
sitting
add
there,
a
like
new,
look,
more
like
advanced
look,
feature set.
switching
But
their
that
head back
feature
and forth,
set is
looking at him
malleable,
and looking at the screen,
which is to say that
and then
we
they
have
just are
our
looping
own
it.
needs for PlayStation, and that can factor into what the AMD roadmap becomes. So collaboration is born. If we bring concepts to AMD that are felt to be widely useful, then they can be adopted into RDNA 2 and used broadly, including in PC GPUs. If the ideas are sufficiently specific to what we're trying to accomplish, like the GPU cache scrubbers I was talking about, then they end up being just for us. If you see a similar discrete GPU available as a PC card at roughly the same time as we release the console,
exactly,
that means our collaboration with AMD succeeded in producing technology useful in both worlds. It doesn't mean that we as Sony simply incorporated the PC part into our console. This continuous improvement in AMD technology means it's dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute indicator of performance, and CU count should be avoided as well.
There you go.
In the case of CPUs, we all understand this. The PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 each have 8 CPUs, but we never think that meant the capabilities and performance are equal. It's the same for CUs. For one thing, they've been getting much larger over time. Adding new features means adding lots of transistors. In fact, the transistor count for a PlayStation 5 CU is 62% larger than the transistor count for a PlayStation 4 CU. Second, the PlayStation 5 GPU is
Even Sony's
backwards
like,
compatible with PlayStation 4. What does that mean? One way you can achieve backwards compatibility is to put the previous console's chipset in the new console, like we did with some PlayStation 3s. But that's, of course, extremely expensive. A better way is to incorporate any differences in the previous console's logic into the new console's custom chips, meaning that even as the technology evolves, the logic and feature set that PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro titles rely on is still available in backwards compatibility modes.
So they're
One
not
advantage
emulating.
of this strategy is that once backwards compatibility is in the console, it's in. It's not as if a cost down will remove backwards compatibility like it did on PlayStation 3.
Right.
Achieving this unification of functionality took years of efforts by AMD, as any roadmap advancement creates a potential divergence in logic. Running PS4 and PS4 titles at boosted frequencies has also added complexity. The boost is truly
meant to say
massive this
PS4
time
and
around,
PS4
and some
Pro.
game code just can't handle it. Testing has to be done on a title-by-title basis. Results are excellent, though. We recently took a look at the top 100 PlayStation 4 titles as ranked by playtime, and we're expecting almost all of them to be playable at launch on PlayStation 5. With regards to new features, as I said, our strategy was to try to break new ground, but at the same time not to require use of the new GPU capabilities.
See, that guy's
For
real.
more than a decade, GPUs have
He just had
imposed
to
a
take his glasses
restriction
off.
on
I bet
game
they
engines.
directed that. They were like, we
Software
need you to do a
handles
big
vertex
movement. We
processing,
need you
but
to do
for the most
something.
part, dedicated
So just
hardware
take
is
off your glasses,
responsible
kind of rub
for
your
the
eye.
triangles and other geometry that the vertices form. That means it's not possible to do even
yeah,
basic
it's only gonna be
optimizations,
backwards compatible
such
to
as
PS4.
aborting processing of a vertex if all geometry that uses it is off-screen.
There's
PlayStation
PS3
5
games
has
and
a
stuff
new
will
unit
be through
called the
PS now.
Geometry Engine, which brings handling of triangles and other primitives under full programmatic control.
Because
as a game
I
developer,
mean,
you're
as
free
he
to
pointed
ignore its
out,
existence and use the PlayStation 5 GPU as if
architecture
it
for
were no more
building
capable than
games for the
PS4
PS3 was
GPU,
so
or
radically different.
you can use this new intelligence in various ways. Simple usage could be performance
They really fucked
optimization, such
themselves
as
on that one.
removing backfaced or off-screen vertices and triangles. More complex usage involves something called primitive shaders, which allow the game to synthesize geometry on the fly as it's being rendered. It's a brand new capability. Using primitive shaders on PlayStation 5 will allow for a broad variety of techniques, including smoothly varying level of detail, addition of procedural detail to close-up objects, and improvements to particle effects and other visual special effects. Another major new feature of our custom RDNA 2-based GPU is ray tracing, using the same strategy as AMD's upcoming PC GPUs. The CUs contain a new specialized unit called the Intersection Engine, which can calculate the intersection of rays with boxes and triangles. To use the Intersection Engine, first you build what is called an acceleration structure. It's data in RAM that contains all of your geometry. There's a specific set of formats you can use. They're variations on the same BVH concept. Then, in your shader program, you use a new instruction that
Hey man,
asks the
primitive
intersection engine
shaders
to check a ray against the BVH.
they're
While the intersection
integral
engine
to
is
the
processing
PS5.
the requested ray triangle or ray box intersections, the shaders are free to do other work. Having said that, the ray tracing instruction is pretty memory intensive, so it's a good mix with logic-heavy code. There's of course no need to use ray tracing. PS4 graphics engines will run just fine on PlayStation 5, but it presents an opportunity for those interested. I'm thinking it'll take less than 1 million rays a second to have a big impact on audio. That should be enough for audio occlusion and some reverb calculations. With a bit more of the GPU invested in ray tracing, it should be possible to do some very nice global illumination. Having said that, adding ray-traced shadows
I thought ray
and
tracing
reflections
was
to a traditional
simply
graphics engine
referring
could
to
easily take hundreds of millions
graphics
of
and
rays a
lighting. I
second,
did not
and
realize it
full
was,
ray tracing could take billions.
talking about audio
How far
as well.
can we go? I'm starting to get quite bullish. I've already seen a PlayStation 5 title that's successfully using
that
ray
ain't
tracing-based reflections in complex animated scenes with only modest costs. Another set of issues for the GPU involved size and frequency. How big do we make the GPU, and what frequency do we run it at? This is a balancing act. The chip has a cost, and there's a cost for whatever we use to supply that chip with power and to cool it. In general, I like running the GPU.
Shit, is he
at
gonna
higher
tell? Are we gonna
frequency.
get
Let
a
me show you
price?
why. Here's 2 possible configurations for a GPU roughly of the level of the PlayStation 4 Pro. This is a thought experiment. Don't take these configurations too seriously. If you just calculate teraflops, you get the same number. But actually, the performance is noticeably different because teraflops is defined as the computational capability of the vector ALU. That's just one part of the GPU. There are a lot of other units. And those other units all run faster when the GPU frequency
He's like, all that
is
shit
higher.
Microsoft told
At
you,
33%
don't worry
higher
about it.
frequency,
We're gonna have less, but
rasterization
don't
goes
worry about it.
33% faster. Processing the command buffer goes that much faster. The L2 and other caches have that much higher bandwidth, and so on. About the only downside is that system memory is 33% further away in terms of cycles. But the large number of benefits more than counterbalance that. As a friend of mine says, a rising tide lifts all boats. Also, it's easier to fully
He's definitely
use
his own
36
friend.
CUs in
He's
parallel
definitely the
than
guy
it is
that
to
said
fully
that,
use
says
48
that in his
CUs.
friend group.
When triangles are small, it's much harder to fill all those CUs with useful work. So there's a lot to be said for faster, assuming you can handle the resulting power and heat issues, which frankly, we haven't always done the best job at. Part of the reason for that is, historically, our process for setting CPU and GPU frequencies has relied on some heavy-duty guesswork with regards to how much electrical power games will consume and how much heat will be produced as a result inside of the console. Power consumption varies a lot from game to game. When I play God of War on my PS4 Pro, I know the power consumption is high just by the fan noise. But power isn't simply about engine quality. It's about the minutia of what's being displayed and how. It's counterintuitive, but processing dense
What's these
geometry
logos
typically
even
consumes
mean?
less
What's that
power than
radiation
processing
logo? Is that
simple
meant to be The
geometry,
Last of Us?
which is, I suspect, why Horizon's map screen, with its low triangle count, makes my PS4 Pro heat up so much. Our process on previous consoles has been to try to guess what the maximum power consumption during the entire console lifetime might be, which is to say, the worst case scene in the worst case game,
no
and
NOS
prepare a cooling
Moa?
solution that we think
This
will
was
be
meant to be
quiet at that power level.
a panel at
If we get it
GDC.
right,
So this is
fan
meant
noise
for
is minimal.
developers. This
If
is
we get it
meant
wrong,
for people
the
that
console
are
will be
developing
quite
games for the
loud for the
console.
higher power games, and there's even a chance that it might overheat and shut down if we
Oh,
misestimate
gotcha.
power too badly. PlayStation 5 is especially challenging because the CPU supports 256-bit native instructions that consume a lot of power. These are great here and there, but presumably only minimally used. Or are they? If we plan for major 256-bit instruction usage, we need to set the CPU clock substantially lower or noticeably increase the size of the power supply and fan. So, after much discussion,
Remember, everyone,
we
if you
decided
have
to go with a
Amazon
very
Prime, you have
different
Twitch
direction
Prime.
on
If you would like
PlayStation
to
5.
give us a sub
We
in this
built a
dire
GPU with
times,
36
times,
Mind you,
we're going to be
our
doing a
EMA2
lot of
CUs are
streaming
large.
and putting
Each
out a
has
lot of
62%
content
more
over the next few weeks
transistors
because
than
we
the
got
CUs we
fuck
were
all
using
to
on
do.
PlayStation 4.
So if you
we
have
compare
a
transistor
Twitch
counts,
Prime
36 RDNA2
subscription
CUs
for the month
equates
of
to
March,
roughly
and would like to
58
give it to us, we would be
PlayStation 4 CUs.
greatly
It is a
appreciative
fairly
of that.
sizable GPU. Then we went with a variable frequency strategy for PlayStation 5, which is to say we continuously run the GPU and CPU in boost mode. We supply a generous amount of electrical power.
Yep, it's
and
on.
then increase
I mean,
the frequency
I
of the
love
GPU
shit
and
like this.
CPU until
This
they
is
reach the
totally my jam,
capabilities
but
of the
yeah,
system's
I feel
cooling
you on that,
solution.
Jedi.
It's a completely different paradigm. Rather than running at constant frequency and letting power vary based on the workload, we run at essentially constant power and let the frequency vary based on the workload. We then tackled the engineering challenge of a cost-effective and high-performance cooling solution designed for that specific power level. In some ways, it becomes a simpler problem because there are no more unknowns. There's no need to guess what power consumption the worst-case game might have. As for the details of the cooling solution, we're saving them for our teardown. I think you'll be quite happy with what the engineering team came up with. So, how fast can we run the GPU and CPU with this strategy? The simplest approach would be to look at the actual temperature of the silicon die and throttle the frequency on that basis. But that won't work. It fails to create a consistent PlayStation 5 experience. It wouldn't do to run a console slower simply because it was in a hot room. So rather than look at the actual temperature of the silicon die, we look at the activities that the GPU and CPU are performing and set the frequencies on that basis, which makes everything deterministic and repeatable. While we're at it, we also use AMD's Smart Shift technology and send any
They're
unused
basically
power
currently
from the
talking
CPU
about
to
how
GPU
the
so we can
PS5 is going
squeeze
to
out
have
a few more
very
pixels.
low power consumption. You're
Benefits
not
of
going to
this
have a lot of
strategy
the
are quite large.
overheating problems
Running
that the
a
PlayStation
GPU
4
at
had.
2
You know,
gigahertz was
PlayStation
looking
4
like
Pro
an
is
unreachable
very
target
loud
the
with
old
its
fixed
fans.
frequency strategy.
Seemingly,
With this new paradigm,
that's not
we're
gonna be
able
a
to run way over that. In fact, we have to cap the GPU frequency at 2.23 gigahertz so that we can guarantee that the on-chip logic operates properly. 36 CUs at 2.23 gigahertz is 10.3 teraflops, and we expect the GPU to spend most of its time at or close to that frequency and performance. Similarly,
So
running the
more
CPU
teraflops,
at 3 gigahertz was causing
like
headaches
a
with
whole
the old
additional
strategy.
teraflop,
But now
more
we
than the
can run it
rumors.
as high as 3.5 gigahertz. In fact, it spends most of its time at
But
that
as
frequency.
Cerny has been saying this whole time,
That doesn't mean all games will be
teraflops
running at
kinda
2.23 gigahertz and 3.5
arbitrary.
gigahertz. When that worst-case game arrives, it will run at a lower clock speed, but not too much lower.
Staying
To
ranked
reduce
with the
power by
shades, I like
10%,
it.
it only takes a couple of % reduction in frequency, so I'd expect any downclocking to be pretty minor. All things considered, the change to a variable frequency approach will show significant gains for PlayStation gamers. The final of our 3 principles was about finding new dreams. It's important for us on the hardware team to find new ways to expand or deepen gaming, and that's what led us to a focus on 3D audio. As players, we experience the game through the visuals, through audio, and through the feedback we receive from the controller, such as rumble or haptics. Personally, I feel a game is just dead without audio. Visuals are, of course, important, but the impact of audio is huge as well. At the same time, the
The
audio
problem
team
is
on a game
people
project
have
has to do a
shitty
lot with
fucking
a little.
speaker setups.
For example,
Like, not
on
a lot of
PlayStation
people
4, there's
have.
fierce competition for the Jaguar CPU cores. Audio typically ends up getting just a fraction of a core. That's not much of a computational resource, particularly when you consider that the visuals run at 30 or 60 frames a second, but audio processing needs to happen at almost 200 times a second. So it's been tough going making forward progress on audio with PlayStation 4, particularly when PlayStation 3 was such a beast when it came to audio. The SPUs in Cell were almost a
Oh my
perfect
God, are
device
they
for audio
waxing
rendering.
poetic about the
Simple
Cell
pipelined
processor?
algorithms could really take advantage of asynchronous
You were just
DNA
talking about how
and
shitty it was
frequently
for
reached
development.
100% utilization of the floating point unit.
Oh, the
There's
Cell
unfortunately
processor is
nothing
so good at
comparable on
audio.
PlayStation
Yeah, but it
4.
sucked at everything else.
Probably the most dramatic progress
Oh,
in the PlayStation 4
VR.
generation has been with virtual reality. The PSVR hardware has its own audio unit.
How do I point to
It
it?
supports about 50 pretty decent 3D sound sources. And this provided a hint
Virtual
as to
reality,
where we could
baby.
go with audio, as well as some valuable experience. Not to oversimplify, but here were our goals for audio on PlayStation 5. The first goal was great audio for everyone, not just VR users or soundbar owners or headphone users. That meant audio had to be part of the console. It couldn't be a peripheral. The second goal was to support hundreds of sound sources. We didn't want developers to have to pick and choose what sounds would get 3D effects and which wouldn't. We wanted every sound in the game to have dimensionality. And finally, we wanted to really take on the challenges of presence and locality. Now, when we say presence, we mean the feeling that
I
you're
wish I was an
actually there.
audiophile. Well, I
You've
guess I'm glad
entered
I'm not
the
an
matrix.
audiophile.
It's not, of course, something we thought we could perfectly achieve.
Did he just say enter the
idea was that
matrix?
if we stopped using just a rain sound and instead used lots of 3D audio sources for raindrops hitting the ground at all sorts of locations around you, then at some point your brain would take a leap and you'd begin to have this feeling of real presence inside the virtual world of the game. This has the capacity to affect your appreciation of the game.
This is definitely important for
just like
virtual reality.
music in a game does. The concept of locality is simpler. It's just your sense of where the audio is coming from. To the right of you, behind you, above you. This can immerse you further in the game, and it can also directly enhance the gameplay. To use Dead Space as an example, I know, old school, you're fighting enemies in fairly dark, spooky locations. Back in the day, if you played the game using the TV speakers, you could tell that there was one last enemy growling and hunting you down, but it was difficult to tell quite where that enemy was. With headphones, you could tell that the enemy was somewhere on the right, which let you deduce, if you couldn't see it, that it must be somewhere behind and to your right. But with 3D audio with good locality, the idea is you know the enemy is precisely there, and you turn
he's good.
and you take it out.
Sony is good.
So, how do we know where a sound is coming from? In the
Actually,
first place?
I think he does a really
Well,
good
all
job
those bumps and
taking
folds in the ear
very
have a meaning,
complicated
evolutionarily
things and
speaking.
expressing them pretty
Based on what
eloquently.
direction the sound is
But at
coming
the same
from,
time,
sound waves bounce around inside
I mean, he's
the ear.
so gentle
There's some
speaking.
constructive and destructive interference, and the result is a change in volume. The phase of the sound also shifts.
He's like
depending
this
on what
apparently in
path
real
the
life,
sound
though,
wave
too.
took to reach the
Like
ear canal.
everyone that I know
These
that's met him
volume
has been like,
changes
he's
and
just the
phase
smartest
shifts
guy
are
you'll ever meet.
different for each direction and also vary depending on the frequency of the sound. Head size and head shape also impact the sound in a similar fashion. The way that the sound changes based on direction and frequency can be encoded in a table called the head-related transfer function, or HRTF. Here's part of one. The vertical axis is the frequency. The horizontal axis is the direction, front, back, left, right, and the color gives the degree of attenuation of the sound at that frequency. The HRTF is as unique to an individual as a fingerprint is. In fact, you're looking at mine right now. Here's how we measure an HRTF. We've taken hundreds of people through this process. We put a microphone in the subject's left and right ear canals, and then sit the subject down in the middle of an array of 22 speakers. We then play an audio sweep from each speaker as we rotate the subject. In the course of 10 or 20 minutes, we're able to sample the HRTF at over 1,000 locations.
Yeah.
Using an HRTF when
Scumsy.
rendering audio creates unparalleled quality, but it's computationally expensive. The simplest way to use an HRTF is to process a sound source to make it appear as if it's coming from one of those 1,000 locations we sample. Unfortunately, the processing has to be done in frequency domain rather than time domain.
That's
so
Dana
there's
Carvey.
multiple fast Fourier transforms needed for every sound source, for every audio tick. That's a lot of multiplies. This computational complexity was the determining factor for our strategy. It meant we had to bite the bullet and design and build a custom hardware unit for 3D audio. Collectively, we're referring to the hardware unit and the proprietary
It doesn't help that he
algorithms
has
we run on
just
it
the
as
worst haircut.
Tempest 3D audio
Ooh,
tech.
Tempest.
The meaning of 3D audio and technology should be pretty obvious here. As for Tempest, I feel it really reflects our goals with audio. It suggests a certain intensity of experience and also hints at your presence within it. We're calling the hardware unit that we built the Tempest Engine. It's based on AMD's GPU technology. We modified a compute unit in such a way as to make it very close to the SPUs in PlayStation 3. Remember when I said that they were ideal for audio? So the Tempest Engine has no caches, just like an SPU. All data access is via DMA, just like an SPU. Our target was that it would have more power than a CPU, thanks to the parallelism that a GPU can achieve, and that it would be more efficient than our GPU, thanks to the SPU-like architecture. The goal being to make possible near 100% utilization of the CU's vector units. Where we ended up is a unit with roughly the same SIMD power and bandwidth as all 8 Jaguar cores in the PlayStation 4 combined. If we were to use the same algorithms as PSVR, that's enough for something like 5,000 sound sources. But of course, we want to use more complex algorithms, and we don't need anything like that number of sounds. It would have been wonderful if a simpler strategy, such as using Dolby Atmos peripherals, could have achieved our goals, but we wanted 3D audio for all, not just those with licensed soundbars or the like.
Wow.
Also, we wanted many hundreds of sound sources, not just the 32 that Atmos supports. And finally, we wanted to be able to throw an
They are just having a shit on Dolby right now. Fucking hell.
Peripheral might have inside of it. In fact, with the Tempest Engine, we've even got enough power that we can allocate some to the games, to the extent that games want to make use of
it's fucking awesome.
reverb and other algorithms that are either computationally expensive
and it's
or
good
need
to
high
know
bandwidth.
that no matter what
But
setup
the
you
primary
have,
purpose of the Tempest
the audio
Engine
is going
remains
to be
3D audio.
the audio
Now,
that it's
3D
capable of
audio
is going to
is a
be
major academic
available
research
to
topic.
everyone
It's
that
safe
has
to
a
say
PS5.
That no one in the world has all of the answers. And the set of algorithms that has to be invented, tuned, or implemented to realize our vision for 3D
Audio is so complicated, man.
immense. For example, use of HRTFs in games is quite complex. Before, I talked about making a sound source appear as if it's coming from one of those 1,000 HRTF sample locations. But for high-quality 3D game audio, we have to handle other possibilities. The sound source might not be at one of the 1,000 HRTF sample locations, so we have to blend the HRTF data from the closest locations that we have sampled. The sound source might be moving, which needs very special handling as that blend keeps changing, and that can cause phase artifacts in the resulting audio. Or the sound source might have a size to it, meaning it should feel as if it's coming from an area rather than a single point. There's also whole categories of approaches to be handled. 3D audio can be implemented using individual processing of 3D sound sources. But alternatively, ambisonics can be used for 3D audio. Ambisonics being somewhat like the spherical harmonics used in computer graphics. And finally, there's audio devices. The player might be using headphones or TV speakers or have a higher-end surround sound setup with 6 or more speakers, all of which need different approaches. That's a lot of variations. It's nice to have the computational resources of the Tempest Engine, but it's clear that achieving our ultimate goals with 3D audio is going to be a multi-year, step-by-step process. Having said that, headphone audio implementation is largely complete at this time. It was a natural place for us to start. With headphones, we control exactly what each ear hears, and therefore the algorithmic development and implementation are more straightforward. For TV speakers and stereo speakers, we're in the process of implementing virtual surround sound. The idea being that if you're sitting in a sweet spot in front of the TV, then the sound can be made to feel as if it's coming from any direction, even behind you. Virtual surround sound has a lot in common with 3D audio on headphones, but it's more complex because the left ear can hear the right speaker and vice versa.
Right.
We have a basic implementation of virtual surround sound up and running. We're now looking at increasing the size of that sweet spot which is to say, making the area you need to be in to feel the 3D effect larger. And we're also working to boost the sense of locality. Headphone audio is the current gold standard for 3D audio on PlayStation 5, but we're going to see what we can do to bring virtual surround sound to a similar level,
headset.
after which we'll start in on setups with more speakers, such as 6-channel surround sound. It's now to the point where some of the PlayStation 5 games in development are extensively using these systems. One of the game demos allows you to toggle between conventional PlayStation 4-style stereo audio and our new 3D audio. I listened with just an ordinary pair of over-the-ear headphones, and wow, I could feel a difference. 3D audio has that dimensional feel to it. Conventional stereo audio feels smashed flat by comparison. The improvement is obvious.
Wow.
So,
that's
a big
audio.
advancement, but
Now,
have
that's
I
what I
entered
call
the
music.
matrix? Does my brain believe I'm really there?
Have
like
I
was talking
entered
about earlier
the
when I explained
matrix?
our target of presence. Well,
Brilliant.
the answer is no. But you've probably caught on to what's missing here, namely whose HRTF was being used. It wasn't mine. It was the default HRTF. The audio team analyzed the hundreds that they measured and chose the one they felt was the closest fit to the total game-playing audience. This shows a piece of the default HRTF on the left and my HRTF on the right.
Very
You can see
similar.
that the general features are much the same, but the details are quite different. With the default HRTF, as I said, the 3D audio sounds pretty great. When I use my HRTF, though, the audio reaches a higher level of realism, which is to say that when using headphones and my HRTF, I occasionally get fooled and even think a sound is coming from the real world when it's actually coming from the game.
Well, that's
a corollary to this is that there are a few people whose HRTFs are sufficiently far from the default HRTF, that's the red dot here, that they can toggle between PS4 style and PS5 style audio and not sense much difference. I've had a few people describe the PlayStation 5's 3D audio as sounding like a bit better stereo audio. Presumably they're the ones at the very edges of this diagram. Which means what HRTF you're using is key. I'd like everyone to be able to experience what I'm experiencing, but obviously it's not possible to measure the HRTF of every PlayStation user. That means HRTF selection and synthesis are going to be big topics going forward as the Tempest technology matures. At PlayStation 5 launch, we'll be offering a choice of 5 HRTFs. There's a simple test where you pick the one that gives you the best locality. That's just the first step, though. This is an open-ended research topic. Maybe you'll be sending us a photo of your ear, and we'll choose a neural network to pick the closest HRTF in our library. Maybe you'll be sending us a video of your ears and your head, and we'll make a 3D model of them and synthesize the HRTF. Maybe you'll play an audio game to tune your HRTF. We'll be subtly changing it as you play and home in on the HRTF that gives you the highest score.
Everyone send pictures of your ears to Sony.
This is a journey we'll all be taking together over the next few years. Ultimately, we're committing to enabling everyone to experience that next level of realism. Hopefully, I've been able to illustrate a bit about our design and decision-making process today and why PlayStation 5 has the feature set that it does. Now comes the fun part. We get to see how the development community takes advantage of that feature set. I'm hoping for the completely
Here comes the fun part, everyone.
Will it come from audio, ray tracing, the capabilities of the SSD, or something else? I guess we'll find out soon enough. Thank you for your time today.
Wow. Wow. Fucking Irish goodbye. Hard on that one. Right, yeah. There you go, Slater. They're going to start a 23andMe. They're going to start a 23andMe. Oh, Jesus. A 23andMe service. Hey, you know what? That was about what I expected. It's a shame because I do think that they should have just... I understand that this was meant to be for GDC, but maybe when GDC was cancelled, they should have been like, you know what, let's just put this out in a blog post. This is that thing. This is where, oh, that meeting we had, it could have been an email. And that's exactly what this is. Although I do appreciate kind of going into the deep dives, especially on that audio bit towards the end. I think that was important to kind of have that for last, because that is one that was very interesting, that they were like, yo, the gold standard right now for audio is Dolby Atmos, and what we're doing is far beyond that. So that's certainly very interesting. But with like the SSD architecture and stuff, like we already knew that. Like they had already told us that they'd already done like demos and shown off what that means and what that's capable of. So I don't know if we really learned a lot more about this than we already knew. Still cool though. Still pretty cool. Anyone have any questions in the chat about anything that they might have missed, that they jumped in late? So basically, round up, they're building a custom SSD, but not only are they doing that, they're building the entire architecture of the PS5 is designed so that there's no bottlenecking, meaning that the speeds that the SSD is able to hit, the system is going to be able to take full advantage of those speeds. There isn't going to be any kind of compromise there, which sounds amazing. Meaning pop-in is kind of a thing of the past. You can start building games that don't have load screens, that don't have tricks in them, like riding in an elevator to get you from one place to the next. You're just going to be in that world, and it is, in theory, going to be loaded virtually. It's going to be, you're not going to notice that it's loading the game at all in any part of the process. So we had that. We had them talking about like the GPU, which honestly I kind of blanked out a little bit on that. Okay, so what didn't we learn? They didn't say if it wasn't going to come out this year. Sounds like both Xbox and PS5 are still saying that we're going to get it in the holiday. We don't know what the price is. They do say that they are targeting cost effectiveness is something that they are being very key on. I do imagine this is going to cost less than the Xbox Series X, whatever price that is. If I had to give my 2 cents, I still think it's possible that these are going to be priced like the Pro and the One X were. So I do think we're going to see a $400 console in the PS5 and a $500 console in the Series X. That being said, I'm kind of 50-50 on bumping both of those prices up by $100. If I'm really being honest, I think there's a really good chance that the PS5 is going to be $5 and the Series X is going to be $6. On top of that, the Series X does have those expansion cards. I think you're going to be looking at $100 a pop for those. So if you want like a Series X with 2 terabytes of storage, it could be $700. I mean, the thing that Ryan McCaffrey reviewed Doom Eternal for for IGN, and he was saying that basically the specs of the Series X were more powerful than the specs of the high-end computer he used to review Doom Eternal. Fluffy Molar Bear says, why do you think the Series X is going to be more expensive than PS5? I think it's going to be more expensive because I think that in very layman's terms, there is more tech being pumped into the Xbox and more hardware features. So I think that the way that these two companies are approaching this is that the Xbox is throwing everything in the kitchen sink in the Series X. That makes it this kind of beast that can do these incredible things. And then when it comes to the PlayStation and Sony side of things, I think they're looking at it as how can we refine what we have? How can we get the most bang for our buck, take the most advantage of this hardware? One of the things Cerny kept talking about as he was going through this presentation was not only talking about the cost effectiveness, but also talking about taking advantage of all of the different components. and talking about how one of the big problems that faces computing is you have all this theoretical power, but when you make these parts have to work together and they all have to work together, you're creating bottlenecks. So the actual speed and power of a computer is not what it says. You know, when you get like a bag of potato chips, right? And it's like 75% of the bag because they can't package it to 100% capacity. If you compare it like bags of potato chips, Xbox Series X is the family size pack of potato chips that is going to give you everything you want, but it's going because it has more, but it's more expensive because it's the family size. And with the PlayStation, they found a way to take a regular bag of chips but fill it to the brim. That is basically the analogy I am getting from, which is a weird one, I guess. But hey, we had Mark Cerny talk about Dead Space and Enter the Matrix today, so it's not as weird as that. That's basically what's happening between these two machines. So yeah, PS5 is going to take better advantage of the tech it has, but the Xbox Series X is going to have more tech in it, which is going to make it more expensive. No. Well, I would. Yeah, Xbox is Pringles, but like, Pringles fills it to the brim. Just think of like a bag of Lay's. You got a regular bag, but it's filled with chips, and then the Series X is the bigger bag of chips, but it's more expensive. So yeah, that's why I think there's going to be a price difference between the two. But I think it's cool. I think both systems are going to actually offer really cool, unique experiences, different experiences. Sounds like audio for the PlayStation 5 is a huge focus. Sounds like with the I mean, I don't know. PlayStation also talked about ray tracing. We still have to wait and see how these games compare, but I do think that to most people, both machines are going to operate very similarly, and there isn't going to be as big of a disparity between them like the One X and the Pro. And I think at the end of the day, I'm not a console wars guy. I'm going to hopefully be able to get both systems this fall. That being said, if PlayStation, if Xbox does not, at the end of the day, it's about the games. If Xbox is not putting out the games, is not creating those exclusive experiences that the PlayStation inevitably will, with a sequel to Spider-Man, with a sequel to God of War, Horizon, we've got fucking Ghost of Tsushima coming out, right? A sequel to that, a sequel to more Last of Us, more Uncharted. Like, PlayStation continues to have the games, and I think that is still going to be the deciding factor, on top of the fact that I think that the PlayStation is going to be cheaper. We will see. We still don't have that information, and obviously everything with coronavirus and the quarantines happening right now, it's hard to get these components, I'm sure. And I think if they do launch in the fall, it is going to be very hard to find both of these consoles. We're going to be looking at a situation in which, like the Wii in 2006, or was it 2007? In 2007, where it was just unavailable. Not necessarily because of demand. I mean, demand will play a factor, obviously, but I just think availability, the supply is just not going to be there. So, I mean, one of the things with Xbox is obviously backwards compatibility. It will have more backwards compatibility than the PlayStation. The PlayStation 5 will only support backwards compatibility for PS4 titles. And then obviously anything on PS Now that is, a PS2 or a PS3 game, but that's obviously a separate service. You can't just put in a PS2 or PS3 disc and have it work. So Xbox does have that advantage. And I do think that technically they will have a visual advantage. I think games will run at slightly higher frame rates, slightly higher resolutions on the Xbox Series X than the PlayStation 4. PlayStation 5. But if you had to buy one or the other, I would still say probably PlayStation's your best bet, because you are going to have those exclusive experiences. And I mean, God of War is the best video game ever made, other than maybe is Breath of the Wild. But I mean, it's an experience that I think every gamer should experience. Yeah, we don't know cost. Like I said, Piper, and cost is a big factor, especially with people not probably going to be having the money because of everything that's going on right now to buy 2 consoles in the fall. They might not have the money to buy one, and if they do have the money, they're going to go with the one that's cheaper. And I think the PlayStation is going to try and undercut Xbox, which is really bizarre to think, because obviously in the last gen with 360 and PS3, it was the other way around. But clearly when the PS4 Pro launched $100 cheaper than the One X. Now, granted, the One X was very popular. The One X sold better than the original Xbox One. So we shall see. But I do think that coronavirus and everything going on with that throws a huge wrench in the works, like it does for pretty much every other factor of life. So yeah, cool. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Remember, if you have a Twitch Prime sub for the month of March, we could really use it this month, because we want to be able to buy these consoles and in the fall, so we can report on them and talk about them and play these games, so we can make more content around them. So if you have a Twitch Prime sub, of course, please give it to that. We are going to be making a ton of Patreon content. So if you haven't jumped on the Patreon or haven't gone to check out your Patreon subscription in a bit, we know we have way more subscribers on the Patreon than actually watch or engage in the content. Please go check that out. We are trying to do as much stuff as possible for the next few weeks and probably months of this all happening. I'm going to be live streaming a lot, playing Call of Duty, all that shit. Doom Eternal, probably going to do a live stream on Friday for that as well. Maybe doing a Doom Eternal giveaway. Fingers crossed. We shall see. Best place to go join is the Discord. You can find that in any of the show notes for the podcast if you are not a part of the Discord. And that's a really great place to interact with other people that listen to the podcast. But I know, obviously, a lot of you here in the chat are a part of the Patreon, are a part of the Discord. Do tune into the Twitch streams, so we thank you for that so much. Cool. All right, guys, I got to get going. I have a Skype meeting in 50 minutes that I have to get ready for. But thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay unranked.